Thank you, Timothy Olua. So, probably 4 or 5 years ago, I preached a sermon in this church, which I'm sure everybody remembers, entitled The Spiritual Technology of Freedom, in which I raised my research interest in the phenomena of the nones, N-O-N-E-S, which are those who are increasing in our population, now up to 30%, amongst certain of the younger population, 40% of the country who have no religious affiliation whatsoever. And when they fill out those sociological surveys that say, are you Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, or whatever, they check the category none. And hence the word nones. And some of you in this church, I asked for feedback after that sermon. You gave me feedback. And because I was writing a book, and the book came out last November entitled Overhearing a Christian Apology to the Nones. And so on the one hand, I want to thank those of you who gave me feedback at the time and helped in the writing of that book. On the other hand, I offer an apology to you because what I'm about to talk about comes from chapter 2 of that book. However, as my family has told me, you have to read that book 3 or 4 times to understand it, so consider this round 2 for those of you who have already read it. So one of the things that really interests me about the nones is the fact that they talk about energy a lot. And for the spiritual but not religious component of the nones, not all of the nones are alike, they talk about a spiritual energy. So for instance, Linda Mercadante, in writing about the nuns, she quotes one of the persons she interviewed as saying, I have trouble with the concept of God, but if you talk about a universal presence or a resonating energy with a certain frequency that gives you quietude, peace, and harmonies within yourself, which you are quieted down, I believe in that. A spiritual energy. Or Courtney Bender, in reviewing those or interviewing those who had a more metaphysical bent, they said the energy language of ki or chi or prana that's centered in the chakra system of the body was often used in practices as meditation, yoga, Reiki, acupuncture, etc., provided ways to maintain a resonance with a spiritual energy that is available in life. Now, a great example of this accumulation or focus upon spiritual energy, interesting to the nuns, is an event that occurs, and I've mentioned this in the Vision Committee before as we've looked at it, across the street at the Marriott Hotel at least once a year. I think it's annual, it might be 2 times a year, entitled the Natural Living Expo, in which they have 150 vendors who are trying to tell you about spiritual energy or energies that can help you in the focusing and the healing of your life. Things like energy medicine, angel readings, aura photography, Bach flowers. Does that have anything to do with J.S. Bach flowers? I'm not sure. Or shamans, reflexology, Tai Chi, Qigong, Reiki, yoga. I don't mean to be critical because I've been there. I'll go back. I'm very interested in what does that energy have to do with the healing energy that Christianity talks about? The interesting thing to me is, and I think I'm fairly accurate in this, if you took the thousands of people that attend that event and put them on the lawn and had them look over here, not a one of them would say, I want to go to that place to find a spiritual energy. That fascinates me. Not just because it's our church, But any church, the nuns, the church would be the last place that they would go to find spiritual energy. I think that's just fascinating, because all world religions, Christianity included, have at their center stories and words that speak to an essential energy of life, and they have different pathways delineated to be in touch with this energy with clear means of assessment to say whether or not you're in touch with that energy or not. And the clear means of assessment would show you that there are certain Christians would say fruit of the Spirit, and that if you do not manifest this fruit of the Spirit, you're not in touch with the spiritual energy. And so words like joy, you see that in these first words from 1 John. Righteousness, justice, compassion, bliss, light, love, peace, patience, kindness is the evidence of the spiritual energy. All world religions have paths towards that. Christianity with a unique path. But the nuns would say the church would be the last place to go for me to find a spiritual energy. I find that fascinating. There's something, I think, of a transmission problem here, which, of course, is exactly what was the problem that the writer John was facing when he wrote the first epistle to John, because the first generations of Christians were dying off. Those who had been with Jesus, seen, touched, heard, focused on, felt the energy that Jesus had, the healing, saw the healing, all those people were dying away. And he's trying to say, how can we put you in touch with that energy so that you see it, you touch it, you feel it? And he called this eternal life, which is not kind of language for heaven. It's life that is not bounded by death, but very much engages this life in a special kind of life. And he says, there is this energy. How do we transmit it to the next generation? So that they can be a part of a fellowship where people relate intimately to one another, so that they have an agape love that is just unmistakable, so that they know in the world who's lying and who's not, so that they're in touch with a knowledge that is greater than any university. That's what he wants to communicate. He's got a transmission problem, and he's trying to write this to say, how do we move this on to the next generation? Nuns would probably be surprised to know that Christians generally have a real interest in spiritual energy and transmitting that energy to others, often resulting in sometimes an over-focus on 1 hour a week in a church worship service on how perhaps we can communicate that spiritual energy. Now, I'm not being critical here. I have the utmost respect for the staff of this church that pours a tremendous amount of energy into trying to allow us to have a presence, we might not use the term spiritual energy, but a presence, a feel, a spirit, an aliveness or not. Is the Spirit with us or not? The staff and everybody who participates is trying to communicate. And when Mark plays the organ or the piano, don't you feel an energy? Or when the Thomas family sings, or Raymond, or Carol speaks, or Cheryl speaks, there's an energy. The nuns would be amazed that we spend so much time trying to generate an energy so that we can transmit what we've touched, what we've felt, what we've known, and what we've seen to somebody who might not know that, so that they might be in fellowship with that energy in life. Of course, this can get a little bit complicated even within Christianity, because for one person what generates energy, and for another person it might not be the same. So for some people it's a praise band. For other people, it's an organ. For some people, the organ is a killer. For other people, classic music is it. For other people, classic music is a killer. Or soaring cathedral, or this kind of a building. How do you transmit the energy? Or I think of the story that I read in Campbell's Notes at one point, an older publication in which they talked about this group that was in Westminster Cathedral in London, and they were feeling the awe and just the overwhelming music and the feeling of the connection with God. And one lady in the back says, "Has anybody gotten saved here lately?" She wasn't feeling it at all, because the way that she felt energy was not the energy that other people were feeling. With a concern for this spiritual energy in churches, perhaps it's not so surprising that from the beginning, churches, Christianity, tried somehow to package this, move it along from one generation to another. They try to replicate the spiritual experience. And so in the first centuries of the church, they tried to work on rituals, communities of worship, scriptures, doctrines that would somehow transmit what we have seen, what we have heard, what we have touched, and what we have known. And hence you fast forward to this day and age. For instance, the Roman Catholic Church, you can go anywhere in the world and you'll have the same service, because they are attempting to package it so, and again, I'm not being critical, so that you might experience in their language the real presence of Christ. It's packaged, it's the same all the way around the world. And Protestants, too, have tried to package things. Craig Van Gelder and Dwight Schleal, in their book Participating in God's Mission, speak of the post-World War II Protestant churches in North America, in which they were almost franchise churches. The same Sunday school literature would be across the whole nation. The training in the seminaries for the clergy would be the same all across the nation, and they were almost like cogs in a machine. You could place them here, you could place them there. Or the architectural plans that were sent out from the denominational headquarters. You can see almost identical architectural structures around the country in post-World War II churches, franchise churches, because they're trying to package something, move it along from one generation to another, or the institutionalization of high spiritual events like revivals. We don't do revivals anymore. But at one point, camp meetings and revivals, and so it got institutionalized, so some churches on the third week of every August would always have a revival and expect the Spirit to show up packaged in some sense. I felt some of this in the pastorate where I was in Hyattsville. Some of you were there with me at that time, in which the community was changing, and sometimes in trying to introduce new music or to try to introduce something that was not a part of the franchise, or Dr. Osgood, bless his heart, if I heard his name one more time about you should be like Dr. Osgood, who preceded me, I thought I was going to die. And so I had this dream that came out of the middle of nowhere, which was probably reflecting at an unconscious level all that was going on, in which I'm a store clerk stocking shelves in a store, and this booming voice comes out of the heavens and says, what is the shelf life of canned religion? What is the shelf life of canned religion? Honestly and ironically, in an attempt to transmit the spiritual experience of Jesus Christ, what we have seen, touched, heard, we fall into repetitive patterns that can almost become like a canning process. Now, to tell you the truth, and the dream was looking at my inside two different ways. On the one hand, I was feeling some resistance to people trying to get me into a can to do religion a certain way. On the other hand, at that time, and to this day, I'd pay good money if I could have a guaranteed program that would transmit my experience of Jesus Christ to somebody else. If I could transmit what I experience when I read the scriptures and study them and God moves me, or when I'm depths of prayer in the silence and in that intimacy with God, or in an intimate conversation with another Christian or a non-Christian where something in the spirit moves, if I could package that and give it to my children and my grandchildren and my neighbors, I'd take the can if I could get it. But it would be canned. And not sure that the spirit survives very well in a can. And so we have to ask these questions, and I'm not being critical of this church, because I think this church works very hard not to have canned religion, but I think we have to ask the question of how do those people over there see us and why? And every church in every generation, just like the writer of the epistle of 1 John, has to ask the question, how are we transmitting to the next generation? And are we doing it in a way that's canned the way we like it, but may not speak a word to the next generation who leave the church in droves and say, I want nothing to do with it. And I wouldn't think that there's any spiritual energy in that place at all. So part of the problem is in the word religion itself. Carol talks about these groups that talk about spirituality and religion, and they are defined very differently. And even by definition in the world of psychology and research, the word religion, the words associated with the word religion in the culture are things like people who are either domineering or judgmental, or these things are found in churches and church buildings, as opposed to spirituality, which is alive, and which is in nature, or which is somewhere else. Even the way the words are defined are difficult. But the word religion really is interesting in itself. The noun religio, Latin, and the verb religare means to be bound to, or to be bound back to something. Think about it for a minute. Religion is attempting to bind us to the original experience of those who founded the faith. And so in the first centuries, when Christianity was developing, the religions were the religions of the cult of the gods, Greek, Roman, in which people were bound to the gods through the religious exercises, usually to appease the gods, but also bound to each other in the culture by the religion, and bound to the emperor, in the case of Rome, Caesar, so that Caesar was Lord. So Christianity was not a religion. The early Christians were considered to be atheists because they didn't believe in those gods. And who was this Jesus Christ guy? But as Christianity developed, especially with Paul, there developed rituals, baptism, Eucharist, Lord's Supper, ways of worshiping, so doctrine, so that we could somehow use the religion to bind people back to the religious experience. Not be bound to Caesar, not be bound to formality, but somehow bound to the agape love as an energy that we were going to transmit in the name of Christ to other people, and that energy could save, heal, guide, direct, discern, give wisdom. Who wouldn't want that energy? And so religion was attempting to bind us back to that. But the binding process goes wrong in two ways. Always goes wrong, in my opinion, in two ways. First of all, and when the binding goes wrong, you get a canned religion. The first thing is that where it goes wrong is that the religion binds people to the forms of religious expression rather than to the original energy of that religion. So the forms of praying, the way that you do worship, the stylistic kinds of things, the practices that once moved you or whatever. And in time, if you're not careful, since it's easier to teach people those things, it's much easier to transmit that to other people than it is to actually transmit the life-giving, actual agape love energy of Jesus Christ. And so we end up binding to the forms of religion and not to the original energy. When you get that, you get a canned religion. We want people to get saved the way we were saved. We want people to express their energy or their form of worship the way we do the form of worship. We're trying honestly to replicate it, but since it's harder to transmit the actual energy, we connect people, we bind them to a form or a practice and not to the energy itself. You get a canned religion. Now, nuns are very critical of the church in this regard, saying that those people over there are just following a tradition that their parents gave them and they haven't made a choice, and so they're not in touch with a real energy. They're just going through the motions of a tradition. And some of the time they're right. Some of the time they're right, but not all of the time. So nuns are critical like that, and it's easy to be critical. When my kids were growing up, I don't know if you ever saw Saturday Night Live and the character called Church Lady on Saturday Night Live, who was making fun of traditional Christianity. We had a lady in our neighborhood who was almost an exact replica of Church Lady on Saturday Night Live. Bless her heart. She was very committed to her Pentecostal faith. She was in church all of the time. And if you weren't, you knew it. And she would tell you. And so she was communicating something about faith, but the children would tell you, that's the meanest lady in the entire community. She was judgmental, she was mean, and so what was being transmitted? The forms of religion, but not the energy of agape love. That was lost, and that's the evidence of a type 1 binding error. If there's no agape love, you might be bound to the forms of religion, but you're not bound to what we have seen and what we have felt and what we have touched, because you're not transmitting agape love. You've missed the point. You're bound to the wrong thing. And the second way in which it gets bound to the culture as opposed to bound to the original energy. Now, we've got to use the language of our culture in order to try to transmit the faith. But sometimes we mistake the cultural manifestations of religion. We see that as religion as opposed to the original agape love. This gets very difficult in this country. And you can almost see the cans on the shelf. Christianity, Southern style, with pure fundamental ingredients, or Christianity, California style, with liberal use of spices, or Christianity, American style, packaged by your local political party. I mean, you can see it. You can see the cans on the shelf almost, in which we've gotten the binding to the culture, not to the original agape love. If you want a good example of this, listen to sermons on the 4th of July. And even in saying that, somebody's already saying, you unpatriotic fool. But freedom defined by Christianity and freedom that this country gives us, they're two different things, and we can be grateful for both, but don't mix them up. And they get very mixed up on something like the 4th of July, immersion of the Christian symbols and of freedom and the national symbols of freedom. They get very mixed up, and often agape love gets lost. And so the Apostle Paul faced this. He wanted the early Christians to be good Christians, but there was a difference. The good citizens, good Christians and good citizens. He says this in Romans 13, but he says, be good citizens in a way that you don't give any loyalty to Caesar. You give loyalty to Jesus Christ as Lord. There's a big difference. And so in Galatians, he says this, you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another, for the whole law is summed up in a single command. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. If, however, you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another. Evidence of the type 2 binding error, where we're bound to the culture and not to the energy of agape love, is we bite and devour one another. And oh my gosh, we are biting and devouring one another in this country right now. And I'm just not just talking about political, I'm talking about Christians on different sides of a spectrum who've gotten bound to the wrong thing. The evidence being there's no transmission of agape love. There's transmission of division, anger, hatred amongst Christians themselves. And that's the energy that the nuns say is in the church, and they want nothing to do with it. You've got energy over there, they'd say. It's a toxic energy. You can keep it. I want nothing to do with it. How might we transmit what we have seen and felt and known in a different kind of way to those who would call themselves nuns? And it is true. Canned religion becomes toxic. Over time, canned religion on a shelf becomes sour. Or at some point, it actually turns into something that's not very healthy. And if you don't have any energy of love coming in to put in your cans, what do you put in your cans? Well, usually what we put in the cans are all our own unfinished business, all our toxicity. We put a Christian label on it and put it on the can, but it always leaks. It leaks. It leaks into the culture. It leaks into our families. You don't have to go very far to see it leaking. So, for instance, major examples, Jesus would say, you are like whitewashed tombs full of dead men's bones. That's a canned religion. You got the label on the outside, you got toxicity on the inside. And so it leaks. The large examples like Ted Haggard, 14,000 member church, head of the National Association of Evangelicals, against, in Colorado, Proposition 2, I think it was, that was to make sure that gays and lesbians weren't given equal rights or whatever. But then, of course, it comes out that he was having sex with a male prostitute who were selling him drugs. Or Paul Pressler, who got the whole Southern Baptist Convention all up in arms, saying if you can get them really excited about two things, abortion and human sexuality, homosexuality, you can turn the whole convention around and align them with a particular political party. And he did that. But, of course, the worst-kept secret in Houston was that he paid off a 14-year-old Dwayne Rollins because he was having an affair with him. It leaks. Or it leaks in families, like Deidre Suzuki, who wrote about fundamentalism in a book entitled Empty the Pews. It's a book to try to get people to leave church. Is saying, my mother and my father had serious marital problems, but instead of working on their problems, they got religion instead. And you begin to see the religion becomes kind of the can around, and it leaked because they sent the children to Christian schools where they were beaten. When that didn't work, they sent them to the Dominican Republic where there was a boot camp for wayward Christian children. She got beaten there. And then they were all in this formation from Bill Gothard's Basic Life Principles that was giving structure to the family. But where's the agape love? And, oh, by the way, Bill Gothard was accused of assaulting 34 young people, interns, over the course of the years and resigned. Canned religion leaks, that's all I'm saying. And we don't have to be critical of other people. Look at our own lives. If we are using a canned religion, we're not doing the inner transformation work that allows us to transmit freely the energy of agape love. And so for the nuns who have experienced this form of Christianity, I would say we owe you an apology. We flat out owe you an apology if that's the kind of religion that you have seen in churches. And then we have to ask ourselves, do we have a transmission problem? It would be helpful for us if we went over there and had a booth at the Natural Living Expo. What would we say? What would we tell people about agape love? How would you transmit the energy? Do we have a transmission problem? Are we willing to look at the evidence? Are we transmitting something other than the original experience of the agape love of Jesus Christ? And if that's true, and we've had to face some of that in technical ways with COVID. How do you transmit this service when nobody can show up? But it's bigger than that. How do you actually transmit the energy of love? And then I think every Christian, every generation has to ask the question, do we honestly have anything to transmit? Are we just transmitting a form? Are we transmitting political opinion, culture, or whatever? Or do we actually have that agape energy to transmit? That we have felt it, we've seen it, we've touched it, we know it. And that's the energy that we want to transform. And that has to happen for each of us every day of the week, not just on Sunday. And what the writer of 1 John is saying, the key word in your spiritual journey is abiding. Abiding and dwelling with God and with Jesus Christ until you're with it. You're at one with it. You're resonating with the agape love energy. And then you transmit that to others in worship and in everything that we say or do. But the whole pathway of abiding, that's a whole other sermon. Or you can read the book 4 times and maybe that you'll get it. But May God bless us in our journey as we attempt to transmit that basic, original love of Christ that comes to us in the name of God.